They called him an outlaw, a thief, a folk hero, a murderer. Jesse James lived with a gun in his hand and a bounty on his head. He didn't die in a blaze of glory. He died while fixing a picture frame, shot in the back of the head by a friend who wanted the reward. The world remembers that moment. It remembers the robberies, the gang, the bullet holes. But what the world forgets is that Jesse James left behind something more complicated than chaos. He left behind 4 children. 2 lived, 2 didn't. None of them ever asked to carry the weight of a legend. Because when your father is Jesse James, you're not raised by a man, you're raised by a myth. And that myth doesn't care if you want peace. It doesn't care if you just want to be normal. It follows you into school, into marriage, into the mirror. This isn't a tale about crime. It's about inheritance, the kind you can't put in a will. It's about the people who bore the shame of a name they didn't choose. And if you believe some names are more cursed than crown, and that silence often speaks louder than gunfire, subscribe now. Because history remembers the legend. We remember those left behind. He was born in 1875, in the heart of chaos. While most children were learning to walk, Jesse Edward James was learning to run, not from playgrounds but from headlines, gunshots, and shame. His father was still on the run when he came into the world. Jesse Jr. didn't just inherit a name, he inherited the fugitive blood of the most wanted man in America. A boy born into hiding, raised in whispered names. One moment he was Jesse Jr. The next, Tim Edwards, a name his mother gave him so the world wouldn't come knocking. But the world always knew. You don't outrun a name like James. Imagine the weight. Every teacher, every neighbor, every stranger at the door. Everyone wondering, will the son do what the father did? He grew up with a photo on the wall that most kids only saw on wanted posters. He was proud of that father and burdened by him in the same breath. Proud that Jesse James was a legend. Ashamed that the name closed doors before he could even knock. He lived between 2 fates, one carved in bullet holes, the other still unwritten. But the world wouldn't let him forget. Not the press, not the courts, not the ghosts that came with that bloodline. And before long, the name would catch up with him. By the late 1890s, Jesse Jr. was no longer a boy in hiding. He was a young man in his 20s trying to live quietly in Missouri. But the world hadn't forgotten who he was. And then it happened. In 1898, a train was robbed. The headlines didn't wait for evidence. They just needed a name, and they chose his. Son of Jesse James accused in train heist. It didn't matter that the robbery was sloppy, unplanned and desperate, or that Jesse Jr. had no motive, no gang, and no reason to return to crime. He had the wrong name. That was enough. They arrested him like a movie scene, no warning, no proof. Just whispers, flashbulbs, and iron cuffs. The courtroom swelled with spectators, journalists, lawmen, and curious neighbors who wanted to see if blood would betray blood. He wasn't just on trial for a crime, he was on trial for who his father was. The prosecution leaned on myth, not facts. Like father, like son, they implied, but Jesse Jr. had a lawyer who believed in evidence and a mother who refused to break. Zerelda sat there, stoic, the same woman who buried Jesse James and now stood to lose her son. The trial dragged on. People whispered, papers speculated, the jury watched a man try to stand alone in a shadow too large to escape. And finally, after days of doubt, the verdict came. Not guilty, not a cheer, not applause. Just silence. Because the truth was heavier than any sentence. Even if the court had cleared him, society never would. That trial became a scar Jesse Jr. would carry for life. It was the moment he realized, they don't want me to escape the legend, they want me to repeat it. And that's when he made a decision. He wouldn't become his father, he would become something else entirely. He could have run. He could have disappeared into bitterness, or worse, into the very myth they kept throwing at him. But Jesse Edward James did something that neither the newspapers nor history expected. He became a lawyer, not just a student of the law, but a sworn defender of it. In 1906, just a few years after standing trial as a suspect, he passed the Missouri bar and put on the very robes that once threatened to cage him. It wasn't just a career choice, it was a declaration. You won't define me by what my father did. I will choose who I become. Before that, he ran a modest pawn shop in Kansas City. He married a quiet woman named Stella McGowan in 1900 inside the parlor of his mother's house. Zerelda was bedridden by then, too ill to stand, so they brought the wedding to her in a home haunted by old headlines. Jesse and Stella had 4 daughters, not outlaws, not legends, just little girls who would grow up knowing their father wore a suit, not a holster. For a man raised in hiding, this was victory. But he didn't erase his past. He faced it and rewrote it. In the same year of his trial, Jesse Jr. published a book titled Jesse James, My Father. It wasn't just memoir, it was reclamation. He told the world that his father wasn't just a bandit, he was a man, a father, a voice heard only in whispers. And now that voice was being printed in ink by the son who survived him. For the first time, the world didn't read about Jesse James in crime blotters. They read about him through blood. And that's when people realized the name James might still mean something. But this time it wasn't fear, it was resolve. Mary was born in 1879, in the final years of Jesse James's life. She was just a toddler when the bullet came, too young to understand betrayal, too young to remember the man the world feared. But she grew up under the same roof that raised an outlaw. And while Jesse Jr. wrestled the James name in courtrooms and newspapers, Mary chose something quieter. She chose disappearance. Not the kind that runs, the kind that retreats. She became soft-spoken, disciplined, proper. The world saw her as a lady, but beneath that surface lived a girl who had once watched her mother grieve while the press feasted on their tragedy. She was raised by Zerelda too, the same mother who buried 2 babies, a husband and a myth. Z taught Mary the value of stillness, of staying out of sight when the world is hunting your bloodline. Mary never gave interviews, she never published books, she never claimed a legacy. In 1901, she married Henry Lafayette Barr, a man untouched by outlaws or fame, and with one signature on a marriage license, she dropped the name James. She became Mary Barr, wife, mother. No longer the daughter of a legend, just a woman raising children in peace. They had 4 children, 3 boys, 1 daughter. But history repeated itself in cruel ways. Her daughter Henrietta died in infancy, just like the twins Mary had never met. Mary didn't speak of it. She endured it. Because some grief doesn't scream, it sinks. And yet, she lived with strength. She cooked, she cleaned, she prayed. She turned her father's outlaw legend into dust on the windowsill of a quiet home. But fate had one final twist for her. In 1921, Mary, the woman who had spent decades avoiding the spotlight, stepped onto a movie set. To stand beside her brother, to play a part in the story she had tried so long to escape. A daughter of Jesse James, playing a woman in a film about Jesse James. Even silence has its echo. Their names were Gould and Montgomery James. Born on a cold February night in 1878. Born too early, born into a house haunted by fear, secrecy, and running footsteps. Jesse James was still an outlaw then, still moving from safe house to safe house, watching every window, every knock on the door. But that night, none of that mattered, because his wife Zerelda was screaming in labor, and the babies weren't ready. They arrived into the world fragile, blue and silent. Doctors tried, Jesse prayed, Z bled and held on. But within days, maybe even hours, Both babies were gone. The family named them after the doctors who tried to save them. Dr. Gould, Dr. Montgomery. That's how desperate they were to cling to any thread of life. There were no headlines, no bulletins, no Pinkertons chasing this moment. Just a mother, shattered, and a father, the most feared man in America, now powerless against the one enemy he couldn't shoot. Grief. The graves were small, unmarked, or marked only by simple stones on Missouri soil. The press didn't care. The country didn't know. But inside the James household, something changed. Zerelda never forgot. And Jesse, for all his rage and rebellion, began to look more hunted than hungry. These twin boys never got to carry the burden of their father's name, but in death, they marked him forever. They were the only thing Jesse James ever truly lost that wasn't taken from him by a bullet. And when people say he was heartless, they never talk about this. It was 1921, the age of silent films and flickering legends. The Wild West was no longer real. It had become real. And in a twist almost too surreal to believe, Jesse Edward James, the son, stepped into the shadow of the father, not in crime, but in cinema. Two films hit the screen, Jesse James Under the Black Flag and Jesse James as the Outlaw. Audiences watched, breathless, as the man portraying Jesse James was his own son. This wasn't acting. This was resurrection. Jesse Jr. wore the boots, the belt, the stare. He became the outlaw the world feared, a performance no actor could ever truly match. Because behind the costume was blood, behind the lines was memory. And beside him, barely noticed, stood his sister Mary. She took a small role in the film, no spotlight, no name in lights. Just presence, the daughter who had fled the legend, now frozen forever in its frame. Why did they do it? Perhaps for money, perhaps for closure, or perhaps after years of running from the myth, they finally decided to own it, even just for a moment. But watching those reels now, you don't see actors. You see children performing the ghost of their father. It's haunting, it's human, and it's heartbreaking. Because no one else in history has ever done what they did, relive their own trauma in front of a camera, for a world that only wanted the legend. After the films, Jesse Jr. stepped away from the screen and into the light of something rarer than fame, normalcy. By the 1920s, he moved west, far from Missouri, far from graves and legends, and made a life for himself in Los Angeles, California, not as a gunslinger, not as an actor, but as a father and a restaurateur. He opened a modest place with a bold name, the Jesse James Inn. It was a quiet place on the surface, but for those who knew, it was a shrine. The son of the most notorious outlaw in American history, now serving plates, not pain. Customers came for the name, but what they found was a man who no longer wore it like a wound. He embraced it, not for attention, but because it was his. He'd earned the right to use it on his own terms. And in that restaurant, surrounded by laughter, forks, and the smell of fried potatoes, Jesse Edward James did something his father never could. He built a peaceful life with his own two hands. He lived quietly, loved deeply, and raised 4 daughters who never knew the chaos he had once crawled through. He passed away in 1951 at the age of 75. No bullets, no betrayal, no chase. Just the soft closing of a chapter that had begun in blood. He was buried with dignity, not as an outlaw's son, but as a man who refused to let that be the end of his story. She never wrote a memoir, never gave interviews, never stood on a podium to explain what it meant to be the daughter of Jesse James. Mary Susan James simply lived, quietly, away from gunfire, far from legend. After her brief appearance in the 1921 films with her brother, she faded again into the background. No one asked where she went, because Mary had always been invisible, by choice and by necessity. She raised her sons with discipline and devotion. She buried her infant daughter Henrietta with quiet grief. She cooked, she prayed, she endured. In her Missouri town, she was known only as Mrs. Mary Barr, a name with no scandal, no story, no spark to sell, and that's how she wanted it. But in 1935, the silence caught up with her. She passed away at the age of 56. The cause wasn't recorded with drama, perhaps illness, perhaps heartbreak. Her husband Henry died the same year. Their children, now orphans, buried both parents in the same breath. No press release, no headlines. Just another fading thread in the unraveling fabric of the James bloodline. Mary was laid to rest, not far from where she had lived. A life so ordinary that it became radical in the shadow of Jesse James. She didn't run from the past. She didn't rewrite it. She simply refused to be defined by it. And in a world that expected spectacle from anyone tied to that name. Mary's quiet existence was the loudest rebellion of all. That's the thing about legacies. They don't just belong to the ones who made noise. They belong to the ones who lived in the aftermath. The James name wasn't just a headline. It was a haunting. And yet somehow, those children didn't become ghosts. They became quiet survivors. So if you believe that not all legends wear guns, that some carry scars instead of pistols, subscribe now. Because the ones who inherit the silence deserve to be remembered just as much as the ones who cause the noise.